Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning to those calling in from Latin America, and great to have you join for the session. I'm just going to introduce our panelists, and then we'll get straight on with the session. We'll keep the sessions nice and short and ready for the questions, so we can hand straight over to Martin. Just going to introduce our panelists, and then we'll get. So without further ado, let me hand over to Amira Osman, who's the editor of the book, and she can introduce the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gareth. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on the launch of the book and the book series. The book series is called the Built Environment in Emerging Economies. We decided to introduce a new book to the field because we felt there was a need for that. There were voices, projects, approaches, ways in thinking that were not gaining prominence in the mainstream publications, and we decided that there was a niche area that needed to be addressed, and hopefully that becomes mainstream through the introduction of this new publication and others, as well as other initiatives. So the Built Environment in Emerging Economies, we spent a lot of time trying to think about what is the need in the field, and we felt that this title helps us address some of the issues faced by various countries with regards to particular and unique socioeconomic circumstances. It allows us to share experiences, but we also understand that the terminology could be questioned. And in the beginning of the first volume of the book series, which is Cities, Space and Power, which is also what we're launching today, we do engage with this issue of terminology, emerging economies, BRICS, the Global South, what the various terminologies mean, what they imply, the controversies that they perhaps generate. And the book does argue a belief that emerging economies, the fact that emerging economies will converge with the developed economies has not always been proven to be correct. It's something that needs to be reconsidered. And what we put forward in the book is maybe it's countries that are considered to have emerging economies, perhaps they will help us envision an alternative future with new economic systems and new social structures as an alternative to what is accepted out there. So this is an opportunity, we think, to reconceptualize our lives, our lifestyles, how countries relate to each other and to the earth. And the assumption that people in emerging economies need to climb up some kind of ladder to become developed countries, we believe that is unrealistic, it's unsustainable, and it's simply not possible. So we really need to think of a new way of life that we hope this will contribute towards that conversation. So the book series helps to find the connections between the built environment and economic development. And it means that we need to understand the built environment in a lot of depth, to understand how buildings and construction are embedded in local systems of doing, in social and monetary structures, in transaction, education, production, in skills, in making, and in crafting. So with that understanding, we also wanted to bring many voices into the conversations around the built environment, and that is why the book series then becomes very important. The first volume in the book series is called Cities, space, and power. And it's a conversation between various authors. I very much like to see it as a conversation. A lot of synergy was kind of identified as we were working on this book. And the concepts of the unheard and the marginalized and the hidden people, we all share very similar values, the authors of the book, but I believe that we just use different, and coming from different backgrounds, different contexts, different disciplines, we express ourselves very differently. And these terms emerged, the unheard and the marginalized and the hidden people. So you'll see that come up again and again in the book, and hopefully in some of the presentations you'll hear today. And we also believe that cities impact whole nations and impact the world. So they have a powerful influence. And with that, I would like to then hand over to the authors to present their various sections. And I'm going to start off, what we are doing is we're posting the bios of all the panelists on the chat. So please do have a look at those bios. But I would like to hand over now to Prof. Ricardo Sanin Restrepo, who will introduce his chapter. And he lives, if I understand correctly, between Mexico and Colombia. And Ricardo, I'm handing over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to begin thanking Amida for putting together this book, this social brain, and Professor Denise Morado in Brazil for introducing me to Amida. I'm going to read a little bit about my chapter about the decryption and the theory of decryption of power and the city. I hope not to take much of your time, just to give a general lines of thinking of the theory. The purpose of the chapter is to position the theory of encryption as a hinge between the city and the urban dwellings to prove that urbanization is the fundamental force field in the political over the last 200 years. The relation between the urban on one hand and capital expansion and the systematic destruction of democracy on the other is not accidental or secondary, but primordial and constitutive. Old-fashioned land grabbing, oppression, colonization, and cutthroat industrial processes were guided by the hand of the nation state and created the urban as a collateral effect. Nevertheless, financialization, high-risk investment, coloniality as opposed to colonialism, and exploitation depend and thrive on processes of urbanization. In other words, although the urban is a historical creation of colonialism and the nation state, it now creates a self-propelled world, an autonomous realm of political and economic reality. Our contemporary cities are at the same time sweatshops, slums, sanctuaries, amusement parks, condensed social brains, factories, and decision-making centers that are gentrified and gentrify the world. The city as a manifold entity, and as such, it demands a manifold theory to harness it. The urban is not a defined object, but an all-encompassing tendency, a dispositional category, a counter-movement from the nation-state and the primordial tactic of capital and coloniality that defines the very condition of oppression. Insofar, it will be shown why decrypting the urban is the most urgent and necessary task of any theoretical apparatus whose main concern is not only to give a sufficient account of power and its social, economic, political, and cultural ramifications, but to attain the very possibility of a democratic society. Allow us to test a first and still very abstract hypothesis of what the encryption of power means. It is the imposition of institutional simulations of difference that condition, neutralize, or prohibit political agency, reducing difference to static and solid models of identity that pose as the only form of power. From this extraction, we can work with three constitutive conceptual parts of encryption. the concept of encryption, what it means, what is encrypted, power, beingness, the people, democracy, and the forms of encryption, the simulacrum that is closely tied to sovereignty. So first, what it means. Encryption as an intentional way of hiding meanings of a symbolic system is an inherent characteristic of any language. It is this that makes language elastic, mobile, imaginative. Therefore, this is not disputed by the theory. However, we are faced with a completely different typology when we deal with encryption of power. Here, we are facing a primordial prohibition, political, legal, racial, to access the programming of and uses of communication as the first common of difference, through permanent qualifications and conditions for the exercise of power, and therefore a rigid stratification for belonging to any possible world. The theory of the decryption of power seeks the conditions of a political ontology and finds that these conditions are only offered by democracy as an order of immanent difference. Thus, it discovers an axiom that it pushes to its ultimate consequences. There can only be a world when it is the result of the production of every being that produces difference, with no further qualification or finality beyond difference itself. Of course, it's not the democracy of the modern Western liberal states, of course not. In this crossroads, there are at least three problematic but central concepts of encryption. What do we call the world? What is meant by power? And what role do transcendental models play in encryption? So the first thing is what the world means. In that sense, everything that can exist and communicate its difference, we call the world. There is only world when it is made up of all the difference that can produce and communicate difference. Henceforth, power is either the exercise of immanent difference or its privation. When power is nested in the privation of difference, it is domination. A primordial denial of power, a false construct of existence and its potentialities that we name potestas. Any and every denial of difference is thus a denial of the world. This denial produces a simulacrum of the world. And then what is power? Let us put it simply as we can. The theory takes its key understanding of power from a rich philosophical tradition that swerves in between Heraclitus, Aristotle, Spinoza, Buber, Levinas, Fanon, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and the late Jean-Luc Nancy, among others, where power and beingness are one and the same thing. To be is to exercise power. Power is consubstantial to beingness. Henceforth, a differentiation that the theory uses is key to all its deployment and discoveries. One thing is power as potentia that belongs and is exercised by every being of difference with no distinction and finality whatsoever. Another is power as potestas, as the operation of absorbing the multiplicity of power, its abundance and horizontal productions into structures of uniformity that solidify it, conditioning and qualifying life as its mainstay. Qualifying life, imposing harsh conditions as well as finalities and hierarchies for the exercise of power are thus, in brief, the main pipelines of encryption of power. And finally, what are transcendental models? What encryption inhibits is the bare possibility of communicating of meanings that are not programmed from a model where the political lexicon is fully hierarchized. Thus, where there is encryption of lexicons, there is hierarchy of beings and objects of the world. Here, a third element arises, the role played by transcendental models, as the core of the machine that executes the qualifications and conditions of life, and thus of power. What is the position of a transcendental model? To dictate from a vanishing point of invisibility, outside language and any relation, the conditions to which every and any form of beingness must abide in order to be. Being, all beings, being a woman, being a voter, being a protester, a lover, being virtuous or foul, in order to be, must be identical to what the transcendental model, the model, such as the Constitution, the spectacle, dictates it to be. What constitutes a transcendental model? The machines of death, whether they are deployed in war or in law, are manufactured by abstract, mystical, and inscrutable ideas such as homeland, nation, man, race, rights. I think for the sake of time, we can leave it here. I think I can I have given a first brush, a first very brief, incomplete idea of what is at play in the article between the urban and the theory of encryption of power. Thank you very much.
Hi, should I bring up my screen? Good evening, everyone. My name is Tariq Tofa. I'm the director of a small company called Rethink Design, where we look at research, education, and design. And I contributed a chapter called Learning to Speak. Before I can go into the detail of what it contains, I need to contextualize the substance that it deals with, because we cannot understand the particulars without understanding the larger context. So here is a diagram of an architectural field. In other words, the kind of things that are part of our discipline, which are key dimensions that we need to focus on if we wish to transform the discipline. The most famous of all is design. Architects dearly love speaking about design, perhaps 90% of the time. But there are many other aspects that need critical attention. Theory and thinking needs attention. It is consigned to academia, and not even all academics are theorists. We need partnerships with other institutions, and we also need institutional reform. And these are almost a kind of a hierarchy. These last aspects, partnerships and institutional change and reform, are absolutely crucial, and there's almost no scholarship on these things. By institutional, I mean institutionalized, not just formal institutions, but institutionalized cultures. So architecture is not just made up of institutions, SAIA, SACAP, our architecture schools at universities, but they're also institutionalized cultures. They have a character, they have norms, they have things that typify them, right? These things, design more than anything else, is what we speak about. But it's completely partial and inadequate. We desperately need, absolutely crucially need, a scholarship on and strategies to deal with these other things. My contribution to the book deals especially with our institutionalized cultures, and there is virtually no scholarship that deals with that. So that's a context of where it fits into the bigger picture. It is one of the most neglected aspects of the entire architectural discipline, of which there is almost no scholarship. So to go into some aspects of what the chapter speaks about, learning to speak, these are just various quotes from SAIA presidents and SACAP presidents, all identifying that transformation is a big problem. And it, as one SAIA president states, let me state that transformation must cut across all our activities. As Luanda Power states in 2019, it cannot just be confined to a SAIA transformation committee, right? There's the beginning of an understanding here that transformation is something that impacts upon many, many, many things, right? So what we need to understand, and one of the contributions that I think my contribution to the book makes, is to understand how architecture, how our discipline and how our institutions are completely enmeshed in our society. We always act and think as if we are intervening in a society out there. But all of those problems exist within here too. All the problems of class, of race, of education, of gender, all the spatial problems that are out there are inside our disciplines as well. And we need to start to learn to understand them. And we need to, and the reason we need to understand them is to be able to develop ethical and imaginative counter strategies. Because unfortunately, the nature of our discipline is that we avoid controversial topics. And so we don't understand them. And therefore we don't engage them. And therefore they reproduce themselves. Okay. So one of the key concepts within the chapter is that I introduces the idea of authorship. And this is simply to understand that we are positioned in our society. We have a class position, we have a spatial position, we have a racial position, we have a political position, we have an intellectual position. We are not robots, to state the obvious. So where we speak from in that position impacts on what we say and what we do and how we think. Now, architecture, as has been stated throughout the day, is really suffering from a critical problem of transformation. So it was formed, our discipline, during the colonial era, and it still reflects that constitution, that social makeup. Therefore, what we speak about, our concepts, what we teach, what we write, every single concept in the whole architectural profession that we engage with is authored in that context, right? In other words, all the ideas that we deal with in architecture are not authored by someone living in, say, part of the former Bantustans, where a third of our population still live, which would bring a completely different experience, a completely different set of terms of references and priorities, right? So what many people today have pointed out is the statistics of the lack of transformation. But what we have failed to understand are the implications of those statistics, the implications of that data. It affects our entire discipline, all our knowledge, all our concepts, all our institutions. The culture is all drastically affected by this. This is what I call authorship. It is to say that what we speak is affected by who we're speaking. Therefore, we need to have transformation, not just for statistical reasons or representation by numbers, but it will actually affect the very substance of our discipline. Okay. And not to go into too many detail, but all our publications are affected by this. One of the most significant publications that came out recently is 10 Years, 100 Buildings. We all know it. It has had a subsequent one on students. But what people don't realize about this is that our scholarship reflects the lack of transformation, the dire straits we are in. So only 8% of 37 writers here were not white. Okay, and of the 115 built projects in this book, only 6% of those 115 built projects was by an architect who was not white. Those are radical distortions, and it's the norm in our discipline. So what I'm pointing to is that the implications of the lack of transformation. Okay, they affect our scholarship, they affect our teaching, they affect our institutions. And then to finally to end off. 2 points that were raised today that I just want to speak to was one of the points was around the difference between data and value. I think Mokena raised that especially, that many of the presenters were presenting statistics, data, graphs, hard science, hard quantifiable things. And they were not really engaging with the implications of that data, you know, the qualitative dimensions of that data. And one of the reasons that so many people cannot do that is because we have never learned how to do that. We need to, the title of my chapter, we need to learn how to speak. We need to learn how these problems of the lack of transformation actually affect our culture, our values, our discourse, our education, etc., etc., etc. We haven't yet begun to do that. And the final point I will make is the keynote by Prof. Joe Noguera, one of my old teachers, is the importance of ethics. And I would add to that that ethics cannot only engage with the world out there, but it has to deal with our discipline. How the everyday realities, not just out there, but the everyday realities and structures within our discipline. It is both without and within. Thank you very much. I'll leave it there.
Good evening, everybody. It seems that our technical difficulties haven't ended for today. We are just trying to sort out the slide. We will be with you shortly. Please bear with us. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank my friend and partner Amira Osman for her kind invitation to the official launch for the book Cities, Space and Power. It's a great pleasure to be part of it, together with not only Amira, but also Ricardo Sanin Restrepo and Tariq Tofa. Unfortunately, I will not be able to be with you, but I leave some comments on my presented work. But before any words, I offer my solidarity with all those who have suffered with the COVID-19 pandemic, and also with the obscurantism and extreme right-wing governments, such as Brazil, which represent a risk to democracy, a risk to civilization, a risk to education, a risk to health, a risk to us all. I am a professor at School of Architecture, graduation course and post-graduation program, Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, Belo Horizonte, Brazil. My chapter, Decrypting Brazilian Territories, is part of my postdoctoral study carried out at the Geoscience Institute of UFMG and of my residence period at the Institute of Advanced Transdisciplinary Studies about the exclusion system in the Brazilian neoliberal city, and of researchers carried out by Praxis Group, which is coordinated by myself. Besides, this research has been just published as a book, unfortunately in Portuguese. I would like to start saying that Brazilian cities are not poor, but are socially and spatially extremely unequal. We are a result both of the public policies the state should have done and of the public policy the state chose to do. The universe of auto-construction or self-built houses opens the conditions of poverty derived from the undemocratic decision-making process of the city, imposed by the State Market Association and the enlarged economic and political crisis. It is worth asking some questions. Why Brazil was not able to change the growing indicators of inequality? What would be the assumptions of public policies if we consider exclusion as a structure and not a result or consequence? As researchers and professors, what can we do? One of my assumptions refers to Ricardo Sanin Restrepo's theory of encryption of power. His argument is that domination occurs where power is exercised by the one who captures the language of the other and imposes qualified and codified schemes of unity and identity of language, making it impossible to reproduce differences. Decrypting the city refers to another way of reading the city from the point of view of the other, or from the different, and therefore far from rules, plans, and models of the fields of architecture, urbanism, and urban planning. Decrypting means to extensively drill the fields of and dispositions of reality, and thus to unveil the operations and practices that design them. Decrypting means to enlarge the action of disobeying and resisting. I believe in the decryption of numbers, indicators, concepts, rules, plans, models from architecture and urban planning fields, that is, on clearing the production of the current language game. My theoretical methodological proposal, firstly, reviews the current language game. Secondly, my proposal creates lines of analysis that make it possible to read the territories and not to diagnose the territory under the watchful eye of those who live and occupy, and not under the privilege of those who draw, plan, or regulate, the architect, the urbanist, the state, or entities. Furthermore, to understand what the territory is and not what it seems to show, resulting in another language game. From there, a digital platform accommodates the narratives of the residents with the objective of visually making available another reading of the territory or other language game. I hope I could contribute to some extent to a critique of the contemporary production of cities, where the resistance means the right to exist, far beyond the so-called right to the city or right to housing. Thank you very much.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on the time zone. My name is Christina, and I'm very grateful to be here. I will do a short sum up of the book from my perception, and I will try to point out how this book has had a strong relevance to my personal work and what the value of the overall book series is for our spatial planning disciplines. So I see the book as a starting point. It has an observation on how space and urban policy relates strongly to issues of power in cities, and how usually those power dynamics are not addressed in our disciplines and in the conventional decision-making processes and spatial developments. So I understood that the aim of the book is that countries from the global south that are considered to have those so-called emerging economies, they have strong possibilities to propose alternative lifestyle and how we can relate to each other and to the earth in a much more sustainable and enriching and inclusive way, and defining an alternative future that will not be maintained with unsustainable levels of consumption that my country, including I'm from Germany, has proposed so far as a developing model to the world. So the content of the book is basically proposing to transform spatial disciplines, proposing a complete revolution on how we perceive, how we think, and how we practice the urban. So I will just try to summarize really briefly what everyone says. Amira, afterwards, she will extend on her chapter a little bit more in detail. And then I will point out how this has helped me and how I think this can help every one of us who's interested here. So, Ricardo Sanin Restrepo, he is talking about decrypting the urban. He's saying the urban is an open-ended system of signification, and the capitalist production, domination depends completely on this urban as a perfect space to extract and absorb surplus value. And they decrypt the process of a few people dominating this process to hide the power struggles behind that. And so he proposes basically the new construction of subjectivities of the hidden people and the establishment of the agency of the decryption of power, where every being is able to produce difference and become a fully functional political subject. Tarek Toffer, he points out that we need to rethink the urban and that we need to address our positionality in when we read about the urban, when we learn and discourse about the urban. We all have positions, and those positions are mostly not addressed as Western Eurocentric frameworks are adopted that just ignore questions of power, of interests, of tastes, and of prejudices. So he basically wants to challenge those modes of thinking and practice and says architecture cannot shy away from some engagement with race theory, as it's already implicated, whether the fact it's acknowledged or not. So he proposes the use of intersecting theoretical concepts through which we can analyze and design. He proposes courses in African knowledges, South African history, and social inclusion. And he basically points out to Matsipa's question, and how does the next generation of African architects imagine the future? Or is it just a linear continuation of the present? So the book aims to tackle this imaginary potential that we all have and that you all have. And Amira Osman, she wraps that up in her essay that she will now present, referring to the reluctance of our spatial disciplines to deal with the political implications of our modes of operation and on how we create space as an exclusive area and not inclusive. So she brilliantly, I highly recommend you to download the book. Look on page 99. She has a list on how the architectural profession does not relate to concepts of culture, of religion, of rituals, of gender, of class, of race. She points out that we can address those spatial disadvantages if we develop theories and interpretive ecosystemic frameworks to see the hidden and to listen to the unheard. And Denise Morado Nascimento, she is basically proposing an example of how this can be done by means of community workshops to allow for narratives of the other and to challenge the language game for city residents to be able to claim political authority in decision-making processes and challenge the whole distribution of resource use and wealth. So how has this been relevant to my work? I'm working on a PhD on capabilities in urban planning, where I try to create a framework for urban interventions to be inclusive for pluralistic lifestyles. And to me, this has been of high theoretical value to read those concepts, to draw on their ideas, and to receive comforting reassurance that I'm not alone in that struggle, but that we're many that want to change the political indifference of our spatial disciplines and want to reach design practices that allow for a livable future for all of us. So in that sense, the value of the book series for me is a platform for this Southern dialogue that collectively is able to develop conceptions for alternative lifestyles and healthy relationships between people and nature. And it's able to forward our thinking of theoretical frameworks for spatial analysis, also drawing on the wisdom and the cultural heritage of all the cultures in the Global South. It's able to create a platform for exchange on methods for including the plurality of voices and the needs of diverse population groups. And it's able to forward visions that can not only orient us as practices and students, but also change the hegemonic domination of territories. So to me, this is a big hope, and I'm very, very honored to be invited to take part of this struggle that I'm very happily adopting as liberty is a practice, as it's said in the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christina. That was lovely. I'm going to share my screen just for some inspiration as I'm speaking, and if someone can confirm to me that you can see my screen.
Hi, Amira, we can see your screen.
I guess the yes in the chat means that people can see my screen. So my chapter uses my experiences both in the Sudan and in South Africa, my two countries, and how citizens and their urban practices are labeled illegitimate, informal, outside of the law, lending to exclusionary policies and people being denied access to opportunities. And I ask, how do we document and interpret the built environment, and how we conceptualize solutions, and how can that be done through a gaze that acknowledges other practices, people, and places previously sidelined or rendered invisible? Now, the tool I have used, and that's the reason for this image of Northern Sudan, a context that I studied for my PhD. The tool that I use in my chapter is an ecosystemic interpretative framework. And what I try to do in the development of this framework is to have an alternative theory base. And I really appreciated what Ricardo said, a manifold entity, the city being a manifold entity, needing a manifold theory to understand it. So this was my attempt at creating a theory framework that was relevant to the context that I'm trying to study. And what I did in my chapter is I took that framework that I developed for my PhD in that particular context, and I just need to move to the next slide. This was the context that I wanted to study, and I wanted to look at the time, I wanted to do a comparison between the differences and the transitions that happened in the built environment over time in this particular context. And so I found that there were so many things that were omitted from the general theory of architecture that I was reading. In the Sudan and in this particular context, the spiritual is incredibly important. Rituals, sometimes rituals that happen in open space, the culture, the day-to-day life, the belief systems, the governance systems, all of these were just not acknowledged in the making of space and in architecture. And that's why I developed this alternative framework to try and understand the small undocumented villages and what created or generated space-making practices in those places. And so, based on that, what I've tried to do is try to find an understanding of the urban, the buildings, space, and cities by looking for clues. So I tried to look for clues in poetry, in local sayings, in spiritual beliefs, and things like that. And with a very strong belief at the time that the intangible influenced the tangible in great ways, and sometimes we were not seeing those things, and we were not acknowledging them in the way that we were writing about buildings and cities. And one of the things that I do talk about is that there's very little distinction between the architecture level and the planning level in these kind of contexts. So what I've done is I've taken that ecosystemic framework, which is presented in the book, and what I've done then is I have tried to then try and find ways to understand the unseen and to make that evident. And I believe that there is much that is hidden and invisible in our cities. So I apply this framework to various case studies in South Africa and elsewhere. And I try to see the systems of negotiation, transaction, ownership, and deal making that happen in the built environment and that we simply cannot see. But that is how then we are able to better understand contexts that are not so well documented in the built environment. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Gareth and Prof. Namdi Ella to conclude the session for us. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Amira, and many thanks to all the panelists for this fantastic publication, this fantastic book, but also a session. I'd like to first off just congratulate all the authors and the panelists. What we've been able to experience just in this short session is quite a spread of nomadic, both geographically nomadic thinking, but also disciplinary nomadic. So clearly you're all looking to think beyond just the confines that maybe the teaching of architecture has that you're all specialists in, but also looking at how other analysis of power and analysis of society, be it race, gender, geography, space, and otherwise, brings all that together to look at how the discipline of architecture can actually move forward. I absolutely applaud the initiative being across global south, looking to break hegemony of global north, dominating the literature and the commentary. The open access initiative of both this book and the series is absolutely essential for this sort of thinking to be getting out there. And what I'd quite like to do is invite the panelists back in order. I'm going to invite Ricardo to come on first because I know he has to shoot off. He's got some students waiting, so we'll bring Ricardo back up. But what I'd quite like is to ask each of the panelists to comment a little bit about the project, where they see this moving forward, and also about how their work and the other chapters in the book, now that the book has come together, how do you see the other chapters, for particularly of our panelists that are here, to talk to your own and complement, and where would you want to be going next with the initiative? Thanks a lot, Ricardo. Over to you.
Thank you, Gareth. Well, I have to clarify that I am not an architect or an urban planner. I am a lawyer by formation and a philosopher by deformation, I guess. And so one of the things I wrote in my chapter in the book is that when they invited me, you know, they made this very humbling and interesting invitation to write for the book. and present the theory of encryption of power, I was a little bit at a loss. I felt in not very solid ground. I thought myself losing ground of talking about the urban and the city. And then as Monsieur Jourdain, the character in Molière, who always spoke in prose without knowing, I understood that everything I was thinking of power, of beingness, of contingency, of capital expropriation and coloniality was urban. That was the place, that was the space. It was not coincidental, it was not secondary, but all the theory had to do with the urban, and the urban was the place that began to speak to me, it was like in a way the falling of a veil, and through, or the remaining of that veil, and through that veil a new life appearing. So it was very enriching for me to have contact with first with Denise, then with Amira, and then with Tariq for my work. I mean, my work truly became enriched and then more powerful, and I would guess more sophisticated in the way to think through the city space and power. And I think it's a wonderful project. I think it has all the taste, all the beautiful taste of indisciplinary or the indiscipline of our disciplines, and the thriving towards social justice and to look to new spaces. So I'm very grateful for, and my work is very grateful with this book.
Many thanks, Ricardo. That's fantastic, and I think this initiative has really shown why we need that interdisciplinary conversations, cross-country, cross-region, but also cross-discipline, and obviously with this focus on architecture in the urban space, but why we're needing philosophers, critiques, political economists, sociologists, and anthropologists to be part of those conversations. And I can see why we need to go there. If I can invite Tariq, if there's anything else, Ricardo, feel free. If Tariq wants to comment as well, how do you feel Ricardo and Amira's and Denise, who's not with us, complement and challenge your own work, and where you see this going forward? Thanks.
I mean, I think there's all the scholars involved are dealing with very complex questions, and their analysis is very deep. And the problem with that is that it needs to become mainstream, and within the design disciplines or the spatial disciplines, there's a tendency to fall back onto default modes of thinking and default modes of working that are not adequate to actually deal with the challenges that we're speaking about. So the problem is, in education, we need to teach differently, and we need to think differently, and we need to speak differently. It is actually a monumental challenge. So we need to produce new kinds of thinkers. We need to produce new kinds of writers. Education is absolutely implicated. Our institutions, which are, shall we call them, the gatekeepers, really need to also understand and not be separate from these kinds of issues. And then finally, we need collaboration. We need interdisciplinarity, as Ricardo was saying, but we need to partner with other organizations, with other kinds of groups dealing with similar issues. And it's only once you have a critical mass of practitioners and thinkers, and once you have an education system that is producing the kind of intellectuals that can actually engage with these kinds of issues, because architecture, at least in South Africa, does not produce intellectuals. We are also always going to be trying to catch up ground, and we're also always going to have a society that we can't grasp. We are speaking at from a distance.
Thanks, Tariq. That's fantastic. If I come to yourself next, Amira, and just to prepare as you're on screen, Christina, if you have any particular points, particularly for Tariq and Amira from their chapters, you'd like to point towards them from your excellent commentary, that's fantastic. But for Amira, obviously you have edited the volume and brought this initiative together. But now that it's come to fruition, in terms of the future of the series, but also how these chapters complement and challenge each other. If you want to comment on that, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yes. So these chapters, I mean, the synergy was just incredible as we started. How the conversations, I must say, were mostly via email and through the written work. It was very difficult with the time difference and everything to really have proper conversations. But through the written work, it became very evident that we were all speaking about very similar issues. From our very diverse backgrounds, and our concerns about the profession, about cities, about the education and practice were very similar. And so the chapters actually fitted in and into a sequence that worked really well, from the highly philosophical, theoretical, and then progressing to the more on the ground practical with Denise's contribution in Brazil. And I completely agree with Tariq. We can't fix our spaces, we can't fix our cities or our buildings if we don't develop our thinking first. So what the book series is aiming to do is to offer a platform for that, where we do develop our thinking, develop our theories that are relevant to our context, and theories that address concerns that have been neglected in cities and in the built environment. And then even in book 2, or volume number 2, which we are working on now, we are looking at practical applications of those theories. So we'll be oscillating between the highly theoretical, philosophical, and the practical, and the books will, and hopefully when book 2 is out, it will give a better understanding for the kind of work that we want to publish. Thank you. That's all from my side.
Thanks, Mira. I'm just going to give the floor just for a couple of extra minutes, just to start the ending of the session, just to Christina, just to probe a little bit from the conversation. As Amira said, these are one of the only times that the authors actually get to challenge each other to and ask that, and to help that thinking move forward, ready for the next edition. So, Christina, over to you for questions for Tariq and Amira.
Thank you, Gareth. Thank you, Tariq and Amira, for your excellent work. Me, as a researcher and urban planner from the global north, acting in the global south, I was very pleased to receive the book, and of course to receive this invitation to interact with you. I feel it's very necessary to have much more literature produced from you. You have so much to say for us to listen and to learn, because I feel that the theories that I've received from the Eurocentric tradition, planning tradition, has not satisfied my own orientation. And I can understand that, in my understanding, we can only move forward if new theories arise that will necessarily arise out of the rich cultural heritage of the global south. So in that sense, I'm very looking forward to the second book, of course, because I think the practices will make it much more depictable on how to go forward. But I'm also very much looking forward to read more about those frameworks that you propose, the intersectional approaches of analysis, the like Amira, you talk about Fraser's subaltern counterpolitics and creation of parallel discursive areas, so that much more voices can be heard. You talk about open governance approaches and open regulatory frameworks, and I'm just so looking forward to read more about that and to see practices to that. So thank you very much for that excellent input that you give to all of us.
Thanks, Christine.
Fantastic. What I was going to suggest is, if from our side we start wrapping up the session, and we invite our closing commentary, which is from Professor Namandi Ella to bring brought up on, and if we leave maybe a mirror up on the screen, and the rest of us can drop down, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this book launch on cities, space, and power. I feel very honored to be included. Congratulations, Amira, for the contributions and the editorship, to Tofa, to Ricardo, I believe has left, to Gat in presentation, Christina, and also Denise. Thank you. I believe, Christina, you summed up everything so beautifully that that could have been my speech. And I wanted to thank everybody for that presentation. What I would then like to put on the table, and I'll make it brief, it's been for everybody is very patient, is there is an inherent struggle. Whether it is the way Tariq puts it about decolonization, or Amira looking at South Africa and Sudan and going back to the layout of the pyramids where she derives poetry and myths and stories, or Ricardo, who posits that there are ways of encrypting power, as well as Denise, who talks about the consolidation and the refusal to make policies that could have made space access. I would take all that, and then the beautiful way that Garth has summed things up. For the first time in my life, the line that blurs or that demarcates developing countries, non-developing countries, the BRICS countries was deleted on January 6th in the United States. I'll make it brief. When the coup happened in the Congress, there was no longer Africa the place where dictators planned coup. It could happen in the bastion of democracy in the world. We are yet to understand the full impact of that experience on humanity. What happened that day? Because there was no longer a banana republic. There was no longer advanced democracy versus non-advanced. Instead, a resilient democracy survived. And here I would say the struggles in Afghanistan reminds me of what you are talking about. And along that line of thought, our own ways of thinking through urban space mutated or was muted from 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, through 1990, the dissolution of, and 1991, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact Zone or bloc, and the fall of the Soviet Union. It was no longer possible to critique capitalism. The person who came close to it today, in my view, was Ricardo. And even then, he tiptoed. And I think the real colony to be decolonized in the contemporary culture is capitalism. And every time we look at it, when we look at struggles like Black Lives Matter, roads must fall, fees must fall, Occupy Wall Street, democracy protests in Hong Kong, the Jasmine Revolution or the Arab Spring, and then the ousting of Omar Bashir in the Soviet Union. I can't name it, the list is inexhaustible. All these, they appear to be very different in different sectors of the world, but they are about the relationship between humanity, social relations, power structures, and the way that we are immersed into it. I would end with one thing. I think every student of architecture, every African child needs a lesson, 101 on capitalism. It doesn't matter what you study in the university, and they need to be registered in capitalism. I'm addressing you, Amira, wherein there is legitimate and illegitimate endeavors, or where some economies are seen to be the legal and others are seen to be non-illegal, and wherein citizenship is there and outside citizenships are not there. But there is one thing that is dominating it: capital. On that, I would say it would have been a great opportunity to expand on this, but I would like to end there. Thank you for the exciting evening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Prof. Ella. There is so much that we still have to discuss. And I might also have tiptoed around the capitalism issue. But this opens doors for more open conversations going forward, and we couldn't have had a better person to wrap up this event for us. We are very honored. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. I hope that I will be able to be in touch with everybody. Thank you, Amira. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks to our audience. Thank you. Wonderful.
Bye-bye.